Henricus Cornelius Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy has been rightly heralded as one of the greatest summas of magical philosophy ever produced in the Western world. But despite its somewhat encyclopedic scope, the text actually rarely details the various magical traditions or the various magical schools or their connections to the Hermetic sciences, aside from a occasional diatribe against judicial astrology inspired by Pico. This is especially conspicuous in the case of alchemy, the art Agrippa consistently practiced throughout his entire lifetime. But despite this, we learn precious little about his actual alchemical theory and practice from his surviving works and letters. That is, until in the past decade when it has been, I think, very convincingly argued that an otherwise anonymous alchemical tract first published in 1572 is, in fact, from the pen of Agrippa himself. The understated De Arte Chimica details an occult philosophy of alchemy, whereby the anima mundi, or the world spirit, is hidden and bonded, especially to gold, and can be released and nourished, allowing for the revelation of the gold latent in all other metals. A fascinating combination of traditional alchemy on the one hand, but set within the specific occult magical philosophy that Agrippa first produced in 1510 on the other. But what are the actual arguments for Agrippa's alleged authorship of this text? How does this text interact with Agrippa's occult philosophy more generally, especially as it's found in the 1510 juvenile draft? And how does this fit into the general landscape of the alchemical theory and practice of that time? And also, why is the last chapter a brief dialogue between a necromancer interrogating Satan himself on alchemical lore? Make sure to subscribe for weekly explorations and topics in esoteric history here at Esoterica, and if you'd like to support the work of providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content like this, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or taking a look at some of the merch on the channel. It's cool black metal style merch if you're interested. Further, if you're new to the study of esotericism more generally, make sure to check out my study guide where you can find reliable text on the general field of Western esotericism. And if you'd like to actually buy some historical books of magic, well, check out my bookstore at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all those links in the description and in the pinned first comment. But let's turn now to what is probably the only surviving alchemical textbook of Agrippa, the great luminary of the occult philosophy. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. Agrippa is, of course, among other things, most famous as the author of the three books of occult philosophy composed around 1510, but not fully published until 1533. In that text, he details a radical theory of magic as the means and the mode by which the magus gains supernatural power by uncovering terrestrial occult causation and celestial occult causation before communing with the divine realm, before ultimately attaining mystical union with the divine, a state of being he refers to as felicitas, or felicity. Now, as I'm preparing this episode, it's kind of an adjunct to the ongoing Agrippa seminar that I've been teaching through the course of the summer and the early fall here in 2024. You can check out that seminar in the playlist above if you're catching this video after that seminar is over. But what's curiously missing from Agrippa's three books of occult philosophy is a specifically detailed discussion of the various branches of magic or the various other divisions of the Hermetic sciences. Aside from a brief tract on geomancy, which I think remains untranslated, a few diatribes against judicial astrology, and his scathing attacks on Goetia, necromancy, Kabbalah, and witchcraft that are to be found in his skeptical 1526 De Vanitate, Agrippa is surprisingly silent on the specifics of magical practice, and especially alchemy. That's conspicuous because one of the very few details we actually have about his own Hermetic practice is that he would set up an alchemy lab wherever he went. In fact, he refers to it as his regular alchemy lab in letters as he's traveling from one locale to another, something pretty frequent in Agrippa's life, he was not terribly good at holding down a job, mostly because he didn't have the social graces to sort of integrate, unfortunately, into court life. Of his published works, Agrippa reveals virtually nothing about his own alchemical theories and practice. The 3 books of occult philosophy indicate that there is power to be had, and that alchemy is one of those powers that is one of the resulting boons that comes about from communing with the higher realms in the great chain of being, though whether that's actually necessary for success in alchemy isn't actually clear from his writings. Further, he does admit to having achieved something of metallic transmutation, but he does admit that he's actually never been able to produce more gold than he originally introduced into a given experiment. To put that into alchemical language, he was able to perhaps augment gold, but he wasn't able to project it, which is to say transform an amount of base metal into gold over and against the original quantity of the gold that he had started with as he sort of ramped up the process of creating the Philosopher's Stone. This is interesting in at least 2 respects. The first is that Agrippa doesn't really elect to boast of transmutation miracles like basically every one of his other frankly deceptive contemporaries. The second is that Agrippa has, despite himself, well, he's basically provided evidence for the conservation of matter through the process of chemical change. More specifically, that metallic transmutation through chemical change is unfortunately impossible. Again, Agrippa's honesty here is pretty refreshing, if I'm going to be honest. And further, in his skeptical attacks of the 1526 De Vanitate, a radical attack on all presumed surety and basically all domains of human knowing, alchemy actually comes through rather unscathed, interestingly enough. Now, that's definitely not to say that his contemporary alchemists do. By no means. He denigrates them as a band of charlatans hiding behind dubious claims, mysterious symbols, and haughty language having nothing to show for all their claims of alleged transmutation but their own ironic poverty. Of interest is that Agrippa admits that he could say a great deal more about alchemy in that text if he weren't sworn to silence on the topic, noting that he was personally no real enemy of alchemy. Thus, in an otherwise ferocious attack on virtually every domain of human knowledge, Agrippa attacks his alchemists in his world. But in a sense, alchemy itself survives his skeptical fury. There's even a wink to the reader that he knows more than he's letting on. And in his letters, which are still untranslated to English, we see that Agrippa practiced alchemy basically whenever and wherever he could, setting up what he refers to as Nostra Chrysotoki Officina, our usual alchemical outfit, as he has it in the 1509 letter to Landulphus. His occult circle, a kind of mutual support society, so far as we can tell, that studied and practiced the Hermetic arts and philosophy, Kabbalah, Hermeticism, magic, they seem to have been the core of his alchemical work, but sadly we know basically nothing about the occult circle, which seems to have existed primarily in France, but extended by social relationships into Italy, Germany, and Switzerland. In fact, while in Metz and in Switzerland, almost all of Agrippa's friends were known to have been alchemists, and even during the relatively terrible period for Agrippa in France, we still see him trying to grow the solar metal from seminal gold, or attempting to subject the alchemical gold to the process of augmentation in October of 1526. Further, in Antwerp, he does admit to some marginal success through the late summer of 1529, again admitting to a great deal of work going into the alchemical process, which unfortunately only seems to have ever yielded the same amount of gold that he initially started with at the beginning of the process. An outcome, by the way, that he admitted was true all the way back in the 1510 3 books of occult philosophy. Agrippa's aims in all of this seem to have been twofold. One, a genuine desire for transmutation, because who doesn't want to be able to produce gold at will, but I think more so the desire to attract a patron, something that Agrippa frankly fared pretty poorly at. But it's also decisively important to note that his alchemical practice dates before the 1510 composition of the 3 books of occult philosophy, and it continued without missing a beat right through the so-called skeptical turn of the summer of 1526. That is to say, his skeptical attacks seem to have had no impact, so far as we can tell, on his actual Hermetic practice, at least the practice of alchemy. From what we can tell, Agrippa practiced alchemy up until the very end of his life, perhaps even visiting Italy near the end of his life to do just that. And it would be sad to admit that if it were not for recent scholarship, we would have basically, well, no knowledge at all of Agrippa's alchemical theory and practice. But, luckily, in the past decade, a very convincing argument has been made that an otherwise anonymous alchemical text, first published in 1572, is in fact from the pen of Agrippa. The scholar Sylvain Matton has produced very good reason to believe that the De Arte Chimica, a text first published in a collection known as the Arethierae Artis at Basel by Pietro Perna, in that text is referred to as Liber de Arte Chimica Incurti Artoris, the book of the art of alchemy by an unknown author, of an unknown author. This brief but rather dense work would be republished again in 1593 and again in 1610, before basically being pilfered and plagiarized by a host of Paracelsians who basically also ironically plagiarized it through the 17th century. I say ironically because it doesn't really at all agree with Paracelsianism. By 1594, the work was actually ascribed to Marsilio Ficino by von Hagelanda, with later alchemists, including luminaries like Libavius, actually agreeing with that. It was translated into German at Nuremberg in 1667, and around the same time an unpublished early modern English translation was made, but it wasn't printed until very recently. It would lastly be included in the great 1702 collection of alchemical literature by Jean-Jacques Magnet, the Bibliotheca Chimica, which famously concluded, as you probably know, with the Mutus Liber in that beautiful, full folio engraving. I have a whole video about the Mutus Liber if you want to check that out. The ascription of the text to Ficino would not be questioned until 1937, where Christler actually realized that both the bibliographical details included in the text, along with the philosophical and religious matters mentioned by the text, especially the more necromancy kind of stuff, were basically incompatible with Ficino's authorship. And he concluded that it was only attributed to Ficino in the first place because the text makes mention of his famed student, Ficino's famed student, the boy genius, the wunderkid, Pico della Mirandola. Though, as we'll see, the fundamental philosophical position of the text is actually quite compatible with Ficino's philosophy, despite Christler's argument, given that, well, Agrippa basically was a student of Ficino in so many ways. But if Ficino didn't write the De Arte Chimica, well, how do we know who did? Well, Matton lays out what is, to my mind, along with my reading of the text honestly, just a really good collection of reasons to ascribe the text not to Ficino, but to Agrippa. One of the few biographical details in the text that we learn is that the author disputed against judicial astrology in Civitate Agrippa, in the city of Cologne. It's, of course, where we know that the author also sided with Pico in those debates. This is conspicuous for a few reasons. One is that the phrase in Civitate Agrippa is a bit of a strange construction, and if it isn't just a printing mistake or a very idiosyncratic abbreviation of the full title of Cologne, Agrippina Colonia, it could be a wink at the reader by the author. Hey, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, I'm Agrippa. Further, Agrippa did in fact dispute judicial astrology along Piconian lines in Cologne sometime around 1507, as noted in a letter to him in 1509. Further, his Piconian attacks on judicial astrology in his later works, like the De Vanitate and the three books, frankly, are similar in style and content to those in the De Arte Chimica. In fact, there are around a dozen or so idiosyncratically Agrippan elements of his style, his vocabulary, and his Latinity that all seem to pepper through the works of both Agrippa in the three books and the De Vanitate and the De Arte, most notably his use of the term occult philosophy, which Agrippa seems to have not only invented, but actually occurs primarily in the three books, and weirdly enough, early on in the De Arte. Others include examples of stylometric similarities, sometimes identical markers, a reference, for instance, to the numbers of the merchants, that's a point made by Pico, the language of Pico, taken up into Agrippa, and there are even entire sentences or phraseologies that seem to be born of ditography, which is to say, they're actually being copied from one text to another, or they're coming from at least the exact same mind. Further, the author seems to be a German, or at least reads German, in that he refers to the alchemical book of the Holy Trinity by Ulmanus, which at that time had not been translated into English. The text also refers to the medicinal powers of specific Italian wines, Malvasian and Falerian, which Agrippa also suggested for use specifically against the plague. Finally, the underlying philosophy of the world spirit, or the anima mundi, is found in both texts, as we'll see, and is fundamentally more than congruent with that laid out by Agrippa in the 3 books of occult philosophy, and that's in fact where he's getting it from Ficino. All in all, I strongly agree with Matton that what we have in the De Arte Chimica is a statement of Agrippa's alchemical theory and practice. I really do believe it was written by Agrippa, probably written during his Italian period between 1511 and 1518. Now, it was also during that period after the composition of the first draft of the occult philosophy in 1510. That, in fact, would be where Agrippa would be most involved in exploding his Hermetic philosophy and Kabbalistic learning there in Italy. In fact, in a lecture, he even says, I was born in barbaric Germany, but in fact, I was educated in Italy. In fact, it was during this period, in the Italian period, after the composition of the 1510 first draft of the 3 books of occult philosophy, that Agrippa would actually become most involved in learning Hermetic philosophy and Kabbalah. Indeed, during this period, it was actually here that he actually publicly lectured on the Pymander of Hermes Trismegistus at Pavia in 1515. Fragments of that actually still survive. He composed his more Hermetic philosophical works, including works on Plato, his dialogue on man, along with his more mature work, The 3 Ways of Knowing God. It was also during this period, in the chaos of the invasion of Milan by Francis I, that Agrippa is known to have lost a substantial bundle of his own writings, including his prized commentary on Romans by St. Paul. This seems to be one of the things that he took most seriously, and he composed it just recently in England. It seems possible that among those lost works was the De Arte Chimica that was lost. Well, it was lost until it was saved from oblivion by being printed by Perna in 1572 and recognized by Matton just in the last decade. But all that said, what does Agrippa, and I'm just going to conclude at this point that Agrippa is in fact the author of this text. You're welcome to dispute that by reading it and studying it for yourself, but what does Agrippa argue for in the De Arte Chimica? The text opens on a pretty traditional note, accepting the Aristotelian theory of the exhalations and the sulfur-mercury theory of the metals. Now you can check out those theories in the card above or in the extensive playlist I have on topics in alchemy. He then divides efficient causation, the how something comes into being for Aristotle, into 2 forms, nature and art. Of those who labor by art to bring nature to perfect nature, a controversial topic in medieval alchemy. This is a whole debate about whether or not one can perfect a nature made by God, or can one convert one species of something to another. It's a huge debate in the history of alchemy. There are those who search only into physical nature according to Agrippa, but there are also those who plunge into the arcanum of nature, the occult secrets of the natural world. Those who seek out the arcanum have discovered both a riddle and a solution to the origins and the propagations of the metals. Specifically, if the metals have their origins in the exhalations of sulfur and mercury deep within the earth, well, one, why can't we just combine those 2 elements, sulfur and mercury, under art and generate new metals in an artificial setting, by artifice, as it were? And 2, why don't the metals propagate freely on their own, like all other substances in nature, which is to say like plants and animals who generate other plants and animals? Why are the minerals so seemingly inert? The answer to the first question for Agrippa is that while sulfur and mercury did give rise to the various metals, that primordial process is basically over, or it goes on deep within the earth, with sulfur and mercury now having largely exhausted of their creative potentials, which pushed up to the surface. Further, just as plants and animals give rise to other plants and animals through generation of like to like, so too if the metals are to be generated, it would be from like to like. Thus gold and silver must act as their own seeds, their own seminal power, to give rise to more gold and silver. You can't make gold and silver out of something other than their fundamental natures. But why are the minerals, especially gold, so fundamentally inert? Why don't they just do this naturally like plants and things do? For Agrippa, this has to do with the nature of gold itself. In his mind, gold is the perfect combination of the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, but, and this is crucial for Agrippa, that perfection is held together, bound up, through the power of the 5th element, the celestial quintessence, or the spiritus, or the spirit anima mundi, the world spirit that pervades all things ethereally. That's the fundamental feature, which is all profoundly downstream of Ficino and absolutely in agreement with Agrippa's analysis of the occult features of the terrestrial world. The world soul, as a function of divine creativity and grace, works to both bind all things together into a vast, unseen occult harmony, hence it being occult, you can't see it, but it's also the very life force through which generation itself is possible. It's a process, it's a creative urge of all things. It's both the binding agent which prevents the cosmos from breaking apart into elemental chaos, but also the creative force from which like gives rise to like. For Agrippa, alchemy is going to be a three-step process in which one renders gold into solution, thus releasing the occult and transformative power of the world spirit bound up in gold, purifying that spiritually active gold, and then augmenting the seminal powers of that gold world spirit to both extract the latent gold in all other minerals, or to grow that seminal gold in a bed of other metals, therefore transmuting them into gold by art. However, within the pages of the De Arte, Agrippa takes all kinds of lovely detours, all of which do reflect the worldview of the three books of occult philosophy, though specifically at the alchemical register, of course. For instance, he details why alchemists maintain the secrecy that they do, because what God has hidden isn't for man to make really public, but only through hints and symbols and allegories. Hamavin Yavin, as they say in Hebrew. Secondly, those that doubt the alchemical arts are idiots for Agrippa. Why? Look at what the alchemists have been able to accomplish. Everything from healing distillations performed by physicians to being able to generate thunder and lightning in brazen vessels. This is probably a reference to something like the early batteries now known as Leyden jars. Agrippa even provides a kind of theology of alchemy. This is my favorite section of the whole book, where he outlines in eloquent brevity how the divine has hidden the occult seminal virtues of all things deep within nature, and how it is an act of profound piety to go searching them out. Thus, the alchemist seeks out the hidden divine, the Deus absconditus in nature, unleashing the arcanum to heal a fallen and broken world. The alchemist is like a doctor of reality, perfecting it through art. Indeed, chapters 8 and 9 do better to capture Agrippa's occult philosophy of the terrestrial and celestial worlds than the first two books of the three books of occult philosophy, and are frankly stunning statements of his occult theology and theology of nature, all seen through the lens of alchemy. In these pages, Agrippa ranges from seemingly invoking the philosophy of Hildegard of Bingen with her concept of viriditas, the greening power of the divine as the infinite creative abundance of God, to even something of being a quasi-Spinozist. He declares that Deus est natura et natura Deus. God is nature and nature is God. A straight-up heretical statement of pantheism. So it's no wonder this text was basically left anonymous and luckily was only published when Agrippa was safely dead. But an amazing tour de force of philosophy in only 5 or 6 pages, and well worth reading just for those pages. But of course, core to the text is his alchemical theory and practice for producing the Philosopher's Stone. It is alchemy, after all. Given his theory of the world soul and the seminal power bound up within gold, really bound up within all things, but especially bound up in gold given the perfection of gold, the first task of alchemy is to loosen up gold such that the spiritus within it can become activated again. It can be loosened in the world, so to speak. Agrippa variously describes this as a process of being a series of creating 3 separate solutions in which the weight of the reagents, the time of their reaction, and the kind of heating that they'll be subjected to varies. The text here vacillates from being very specific to very, very vague. And because of how Agrippa equivocates on technical terms, it's often difficult to follow exactly his direction and the logic of the procedure, and I'm very confident that's on purpose. I mean, it's pretty typical of alchemical text. You have to give away just enough to be recognized for knowing that you know what you're doing. I know that you know that I know, but not enough to allow anyone to reproduce what you've done or to accurately criticize you. You can always be like, well, you didn't do exactly what I said, because no one exactly understands precisely what you mean. Regardless, he outlines two distinct procedures to produce the stone. First, a process of solution and separation through distillation, followed secondarily by conjunction and fixation, perhaps through sublimation or maybe even by reflux distillation, resulting finally in augmentation. Thus, the stone is produced by a threefold cycle. Agrippa loves cycles of three and processes of three, a process of solution, fixation, and conjunction. In another place, he explodes this process out a little bit to include compounding, then putrefaction, then dissolution, division, cleansing, unification, and then a final augmentation, and then presumably projection, the actual production of gold, but Agrippa never really talks about it greatly. Regardless, Agrippa gives rather specific instructions about the materials, vessels, ratios, the visual cues. We get the appearance of the alchemical rainbow, along with heating regimens from the heat of the dragon's breath to the heat of a hen laying on her nest, to be used all to prepare his first solution, which is then apparently subjected to repeated distillation. But Agrippa is a bit more specific here, and he details a process by which mercury is first purified by the addition of salt and then filtered through leather. The text here says copper, but that's clearly a printing error. Those really matter in alchemical texts, so read your text carefully. At any rate, that is all combined with very finely beaten or pulverized gold and then gently heated with ash. The interaction produces an emission that results in the famed alchemical rainbow. Once the rainbow has appeared, the gold has now been rendered into solution and the creative power of the world spirit is now operative, in it is now active. Once that's occurred, the task of purification begins. This mixture is then distilled at least once, and that casts out Satan from heaven as he have it, leaving behind what he calls sulfuric gold in the alembic and producing what he calls living water in the condenser. The next step, we are told, requires direct divine intervention. And then a miracle happens. In fact, Agrippa compares the gold here as sort of inert and unalive to statues that are in need of direct divine animation to interact into a actual living being. That's a direct reference to the Hermetic Asclepius because, of course, it is a direct reference to the Hermetic Asclepius. That sulfur is then subjected to an intense heat, which seems to sufficiently purify it for further use, as it is then added back to the living waters. This compound is then inserted into a specially designed furnace and subjected to a very specific heating regime, which produces the precious white stone, the unity of the sun and moon. From here, the stone must be augmented, that is to say, it must be brought to maturity such that it can reproduce, i.e., generate future gold. This is done by subjecting the white stone back to the previous collected distillate and distilling it over and over and over and over again. Multiple, even dozens of distillations, of course, were hallmarks of many alchemical processes at this time, but sufficiently augmented, the white stone can now create alchemical silver. However, a final stage of rubification, the stone has to be made red, will allow the stone to tinge iron and copper. This is apparently done by placing the white stone in a vessel along with the metal to be transmuted, in addition to a sufficient quantity of aqua fortis or nitric acid. Of course, the nitric acid would attack the copper or iron, but it would not attack the gold. You need aqua regia to do that. It would leave behind a solution of dross, or feces as the alchemists typically have it, along with a cleansed, pure chunk of gold. How much gold? Well, Agrippa tells us in the 3 books of occult philosophy the exact same amount of gold that he started the process with. Recall, Agrippa admits on several occasions that he could generate pure, beautiful gold, but never produce or project more than he actually started with. That's a stark, brutal, honest lesson in the conservation of mass, no matter how complex, repeated, or violent a series of chemical reactions are. Regardless of what one thinks of Agrippa, at least he was honest. At least Agrippa was honest, unlike so many of his alchemist comrades, about the outcomes of his alchemical experiments. That's praise we can reserve for only a few of these so-called adepts. In yet another interlude after this, Agrippa details the whole process in the figural form of the hermaphrodite, a famous favorite of alchemical imagery, combining all the forces of opposition into one singular totality. This particular image that he has in mind seemingly comes down to us in several different forms, especially in the illustrations found in the Book of the Holy Trinity, but also illustrated in the Rosarium Philosophorum. We're also told that his alchemical gold, of course, has healing properties. In fact, Agrippa seems to follow the alchemical medicine of people like John Arupshissa, whereby certain amounts of alchemical gold are then heated to activate them and then introduced into distilled wine, typically by heating and then quenching a small amount of gold in aqua vitae. Though Agrippa does specify that the best wines for this procedure are the very, very fine Malvasian and the Falerian wine, which at that time had a reputation for their quality and their extremely high price. In fact, Thomas Müntzer, the great reformer and peasant rebel, mocks Martin Luther for engaging in drinking these kinds of wines. He's too fancy. The penultimate chapter recapitulates the alchemical procedure laid out in the previous chapters, even providing an alternative route, or maybe even routes, by which to create the Philosopher's Stone. Agrippa seems to be kind of a let's try a lot of different things and see what works kind of guy, though all three contain the same threefold processes of dissolution, purification, and augmentation, using mercury and gold as the basic starting points of the great work. Some versions of the text even note that the work was basically left anonymous because of the Inquisition, which makes total theological sense if you rewind back to those more theological alchemical chapters that I mentioned, chapters 8 and 9, which, as I noted, those go full tilt pantheism. So the Inquisition wasn't about that, and it's good Agrippa never put his name on it. Never go full pantheism in the 16th century. Never go full pantheism. They burn you for that. Finally, there's a curious appendix to the work as well. Chapter 20 is a wonderfully strange little dialogue in which a necromancer named Elardus has apparently bound the devil. He's bound the devil and basically interrogates him about alchemy. So that's fun. It's exactly the kind of thing we like around here in Esoterica land. Of course, bound by the necromancer, the devil is forced to answer about 15 questions, 15 fun facts about alchemy, because bound with divine names, the devil can't lie. So what do we learn? We learned about the ubiquity of gold in all metals, the presence of the world soul in the metals, the production of the Philosopher's Stone is possible, the devil admits, although it's quite difficult, that things have exoteric and esoteric colors. The hidden esoteric color of the Philosopher's Stone is blue, but white to regular sight, although typically it's described as being red in most literature, so you trust the devil as far as you can throw him. The exact healing and transformative powers of the stone, it can cure leprosy, that the Roman poet Virgil, and along with many others have produced the Philosopher's Stone, exactly how long it takes to produce it, before eventually the devil kind of gets exhausted with all the things that he can admit to our friendly necromancer friend Elardus. Now, this section was probably not part of the original text written by Agrippa, and was likely included because both texts contain the idea that the metals contain an aspect of the world soul, and to be honest, Agrippa would have rejected the idea that a demon, specifically the devil himself, the devil, could have actually been bound by any such necromancer using any such wizardry. But it's a great little appendix, and who doesn't like a little bit of good old-fashioned necromancy just peppered there at the end to send you off to a good day. Agrippa is famous and rightly celebrated for his contributions to Western esotericism, spirituality, and the philosophy of the occult. And frankly, his secrets are still being revealed to us in upcoming translations, and even texts that have apparently survived right before our very noses, attributed to other people like Ficino. The De Arte Chimica, very probably composed by Agrippa in the Italian period, is an absolutely wonderful combination of the occult philosophy that he had developed around 1510, though not published to the world until 1533, but expressed in the theory and practice of that great Hermetic science, my first esoteric love, alchemy. You can consult the critical edition by Matton, published in 2014, which includes a somewhat corrected, though I would not totally trust it, but somewhat corrected edition of the mid-17th century modern English translation found in Sloane 3638, folios 129 through 188. However, as I mentioned, significant corruptions have crept into every edition that I've consulted, especially in the more technical alchemical discussions of the relationship of sulfur, copper, mercury, and earth. Those symbols seem to get all scrambled in the text, so you'll need some alchemical discernment to study it closely. This is especially troubling considering the fact that mercury is central to Agrippa's whole procedure. That said, Matton edition is wonderful, and you can consult the early modern English edition at Adam McLean's amazing, wonderful website in the edition prepared by Justin von Budros, which is fantastic, and we should be very thankful that he did the work of transcribing that Sloane manuscript. Of course, more Agrippa, definitely more alchemy to come. Until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thanks for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. In Agrippa